Okay, part three of Seamus Heaney's Storm on the Island. And instead of reading through and going into the third part, we're going to look at a metaphorical reading of the poem. So the first two parts we've looked at a literal level, storm on the island, the storm, the wind, the battering of the community by the gales that come across the Atlantic. And in that sense, there's so much that you can write about, even on the literal sense. And it compares nicely with any of the poems about nature. You could link it to Ozymandias with the hints of nature and the power there. Really goes well with the prelude, with exposure, where you're really looking at the power of the weather. But if you look at it on a metaphorical level as well, there's even more that you can get out of Storm on the Island. And instead of looking at the whole poem, I've just picked out a series of images which have a different reading if we look at it this way. So let's start with the title, Island, Island. We've talked about how Seamus Heaney set this poem on the northwestern coast of the Republic of Ireland, very near Northern Ireland. And these two words are homophones. What if he's not talking about an island, any island, but talking about Ireland, the storm that is engulfing Ireland? Now, if you look back at the context of this poem, Seamus Heaney was writing this poem in the middle of what were called the Troubles. And the Troubles in Northern Ireland were because of the differences between the Catholic and Protestant communities, both Christian communities, but politically and religiously, and in a large sense their loyalty or otherwise to either Ireland as a whole or to Great Britain. That they were the differences that caused the Troubles, which became incredibly violent. There were bombings and killings at a very, very tense time, particularly for Northern Ireland. But Seamus Heaney here is warning that troubles that start in one part of a country or one part of an island can easily expand into other parts if they're not watched. So in this reading, the tone isn't reassuring as it was with the weather. It's much more of a warning tone. So if we take the whole poem as an extended metaphor, and the island isn't I-S-L-A-N-D, but Ireland, the nation of Ireland, the troubled nation of Ireland, divided by its religious and political communities. So the storm then is the Troubles. We've heard of, it's an easy metaphor to think of, isn't it, as a storm of trouble, of violence, of discontent, of difference. So the storm is actually those differences, the attacks from the Catholic and Protestant communities on each other. And so let's take that reading and we look at the divide between the Catholics and the Protestants. Let's imagine it this way and take some of the images that we've looked at that are about the weather and turn them into being about the troubles, the violence between the two communities. We build our houses squat. Now, we talked before about how squat means low and wide, but that might also suggest the way that the religious communities build their own community. They build them not to be troubled, not to be disturbed, not to alter in any way. So in a sense, we build our houses squat is actually about stubbornness, not listening to the other side, only thinking about your own house, your own religion, your own political views, and not bending to any other way. And notice again, it's in the present tense. This happens all the time. We build our houses squat. We're not listening to other people. We are being stubborn. We're not trying to negotiate and come to compromises. So Heaney there is being critical, perhaps, of both sides, not giving way to each other, not coming up to some sort of decent conclusion. Then, let's go further down in the poem, exploding comfortably. Now, Heaney was writing this in a rural agricultural community. So largely speaking, fairly unaffected by the troubles that were happening elsewhere. So he's imagining perhaps the community watching the news unfold as if it is elsewhere. It explodes comfortably. Exploding now is not the sound of the water perhaps, but the sound of bombs. The very real threat of bombs that did happen many, many times over the Troubles. So if they're exploding comfortably, Heaney's thinking that actually they're becoming rather complacent about their own position. They're not thinking that the troubles could ever come here, won't be here, it's elsewhere. Look, those bombs are exploding in Belfast, in Omagh, in the biggest cities in Northern Ireland, not to us. But Heaney is warning it's not comfortable because it spits like a tame cat turned savage. And again now, thinking about the metaphorical reading of this, this is not the water, but the outcomes from the troubles, the outcomes from the bombings. So he's saying, no, they're not comfortable. We're not comfortable with them exploding elsewhere because trouble could easily come in our direction. So something that seems calm, that seems distant, like a tame cat, could turn savage, could affect our community. So he's really warning his community that trouble could arrive. There's no place to be complacent. We do not rest on our laurels. We cannot just wait for these troubles to happen elsewhere. They will consume the whole of the country if we don't get them sorted. So the tone isn't reassuring, it's warning, it's critical. Heaney is giving stark advice that the community must act now to mend its differences. Let's have a look at the images of violence now, which in the previous reading perhaps were more metaphorical, about the wind, strafes, the salvo, bombarded with empty air. Now these take on a more literal, sinister turn, don't they? They were fairly sinister in the first reading of the poem, but now we think of the images of violence. Strafes, remember, is a low-flying attack, so it becomes much more dangerous, much more real when we start talking about gunfire and bombs that happened through the Troubles. The salvo, the quick in and out. There was an awful lot of targeted killings like a salvo, so it becomes much more sinister in this reading. Bombarded. It's not too much of a stretch to think about the Troubles coming to the community and being real, people being killed in his, what he thought, or what the community thought was an isolated community, but no, they can be hit with these very real threats. And finally, this reassuring tone in the first reading, strange, it's a huge nothing that we fear, don't worry about the wind. That tone is very, very different if we look at the metaphorical reading of the poem. Strange, it is a huge nothing that we fear. Let's think about what the huge nothing could be. What divided the communities principally was religion. And the two religions, Catholics and Protestants, are actually denominations of the same religion, of Christianity. And actually the differences between the two communities are much less than the similarities between Protestantism and Catholicism. They believe in God, they believe in Jesus, they believe in resurrection, they read the Bible. Countless similarities and only small differences. So Heaney's being critical here, the tone is critical. Strange. Why is it that we disagree? It's strange, it's odd. We shouldn't be disagreeing because it's a huge nothing that we fear. And there was genuine fear between the Catholics and the Protestants, fear of each other. And the fear, Heaney is telling us, is that the differences are small. There's much more that brings the Catholics and the Protestants together than there is that divides them. Those differences are small, and that oxymoron, that huge nothing, are the small differences that are made much, much bigger in the religious conflict in the community. So, looking at that particular metaphorical reading, that brings this as a poem into line with other poems about war, about conflict. So again, goes really, really well with exposure. But it could bring in some of the poems like War Photographer, Bayonet Charge, Kamikaze, Remains, poems that are more about war. So if you know this poem and you're confident with this metaphorical reading, it's a really good poem to look at nature and to look at conflict with people as well.